I'm Mark Conrad. As I mentioned earlier, I'm part of the Advanced Information Collaboratory. Full disclosure, so is Bruce, and Bruce is listed his affiliation as the primary Trustworthy Digital Repository Authorization Body Limited, better known as PTAB, and I'm also a member of PTAB. All right, next. So the theme of our paper is that CAS needs to be a two-way street. And much of the literature that's been written about computational archival science has been about archives adopting computational theories and practices, and very little has been written about computational professionals adopting archival theories, methods, or practices. And we believe that CAS could be substantially enriched if some of the archival practices, theories, etc., were adopted by the computational professionals that are developing systems that create and store big data. It's interesting, in this month's communications of the ACM, there are a number of articles that speak directly to this point. There's a critique of computational thinking having too much of a focus on the very basics of computation and being focused on K through 12. And the author's contention is that there needs to be computational thinking for professionals. There's also an article on automating very low-level provenance during the creation process for big data, for records. And there's a third article on how creators need to document their creations better. And of course, all these, there's literally millennia of archival theory, methods, and practices that could inform those topics. So that's our thesis. So for our paper, we decided to focus in on two examples of archival resources that we think could be useful. And those are ISO 14721, Open Archival Information System Reference Model, and ISO 16363, Audit and Certification of Trustworthy Digital Repositories. Both of those are widely cited in the archival literature. They're focused on long-term preservation of digital assets and, more importantly, maintaining the understandability of those assets through time, how to build repositories that are trustworthy, and how to maintain provenance and integrity of the repository's collections, and ensure that you're providing adequate evidence for consumers to make a judgment about the authenticity of their collections. So these are just two archival resources that we thought we could use to illustrate our points. You'll see on the screen, it says a very high-level overview. Bruce likes to say he's given a couple of minutes to describe what normally he describes in a 5-day course. So anyway, the Open Archival Information System reference model is just that. It's a reference model. It doesn't prescribe a particular design or implementation. And basically, an OAIS, as opposed to another repository, negotiates and accepts appropriate information, obtains sufficient control of that information prior to the level needed to ensure long-term preservation. And you'll see throughout the presentation that certain phrases are capitalized, And that's because they're terms that are defined in the OAIS reference model. Long-term preservation has to do with keeping records alive and understandable and usable for as long as they're needed. That may be, a couple of years, that may be quote unquote forever. So it requires some extra thinking and some extra work. The OAIS also determines which communities will be the designated community and should be able to understand the information. In fact, the OAIS is responsible for ensuring that the information is independently understandable to the designated community, and then makes the information available to the designated community and enables the information to be disseminated as copies of or traceable to the original submitted data objects. This is important. The OAIS can't vouch for the authenticity or provide evidence of the authenticity in many cases of the data before it's submitted to the repository, although certainly you encourage the producers to give you the chain of custody back to the original creation of the records. All right, 16363, again, we teach a full week course on this. It provides the processes for auditing and assessing the trustworthiness of digital repositories. There are 100+ metrics and submetrics in there, and the three main categories, the three most important sections of the standard, have to do with organizational infrastructure. Is there a mission statement that includes long-term preservation? Is there adequate staff with adequate training to maintain the deposits, the records, the information that's sent to them? Are there financial resources? Is there a succession plan? Is there someone who can take over the records should the repository itself go out of business? The next section, section 4, is specific to digital object management. What kinds of things do you need to have? And these are information objects are packaged in information packages. And the most critical one of those is the archival information package, which has the content data, the representation information, the documentation that makes that content data understandable, and then also preservation description information, which includes things like context, provenance, integrity. I'm forgetting some of them, but you get the idea. It's a very extensive list of things that need to be looked at. Section 5 has to do with infrastructure and security risk management. This looks at everything from obsolescence of technology or obsolescence of the formats that the data are stored in, to who has the keys to get into the building where the information is located. And that one gets real interesting when you start talking about records stored in the cloud. So that's a very high level overview of ISO 16363. And one thing I need to mention is that not only is this providing guidance on how to audit a repository to check on its trustworthiness, but it's also a roadmap for building a trustworthy digital repository. And in fact, a number of organizations have used the metrics and submetrics to do just that, to think about how they're going to build their repository. So here's why we think there needs to be more traffic going from the archivists to the computer scientists and other IT professionals. Researchers, people that use the data, and funders are placing a high value on data reuse, provenance, authenticity, documentation, and sustainability. In the past, there have been literally billions spent on projects where data was unusable after a few years because it hadn't been properly maintained, documented, explained. A few years ago, the National Science and Technology Council issued a report on measuring the impact of digital repositories, and one of the recommendations was to expand the use of trustworthy digital repository certification initiatives to ensure that a repository's digital material is authentic, reliable, accessible, and usable on a continuing basis. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the NSTC. It's a committee that reports to the science advisor to the President of the United States. So this is a fairly high-level committee that's issuing this call, and major government funders like NIH and NSF are responding to this in the requirements they're placing on new grants. So OAS and the Trustworthy Digital Repository provide guidance on all the issues that I've mentioned here. The designated community requires that a repository think about who it's collecting the data for and what's the knowledge base of that community. If, you know, a lot of archives like to say that their audience, their targeted, their designated community is the general public. Well, that doesn't work. You can't make every piece of information that you hold understandable to any person anywhere in the world. At the very least, you have the problem of multiple languages that you would have to support. You'd have to translate everything that you had. But also, most records assume some kind of minimal, what am I trying to say? Minimal knowledge base, minimal understanding of what's going on. I'm sorry, there's 3 messages in the chat and I can't open the chat for some reason. Is there something I need to respond to?
No, I think you should just carry on with your presentation, Mark. That's meant to be parallel to your presentation, and maybe some questions for you afterwards.
Okay, sorry, but for some reason I can't unlock the chat. Thanks, Peter. So thinking hard about who you're collecting the data for and what it might be used for and how to keep it understandable to the people that have a certain level of knowledge is critical to thinking about how you're going to preserve something over the long term. So these 2 standards also provide guidance on acquiring and maintaining provenance. The recommended practices provide a way to produce substantial evidence of the authenticity of the holdings. And another thing that a lot of people seem to forget, especially data creators, is that preserving and providing access to data is not a one and done operation. So it takes a lot of work, and it's continuous work, and it's not a cheap process. You've got to have staff, infrastructure, finances, organizational support. So anyway, there's a lot that can be done there that could help the data creators, the system creators that are creating big data, to think about making their stuff available beyond their initial use of the data. And now my screen is stuck. There we go. So this is just my summary. I've just given you a high-level view of 2 archival standards and what those standards are good for. To use these standards should lead to closer collaboration between computational and archival professionals. And our assertion is that that will enrich CAS. I won't lie, the archival standards that I'm discussing are not light reading, and most people who have tried to use them engage an archivist in their discussions. And we think the more that discussion and the more archival practices and theories are infused into the creation of the new systems that are coming along, or the existing systems, will enrich CAS. There's our contact information, and if the slides are not already up on the workshop website, they will be. Here's where you can get copies of the 2 standards and the NSTC report that I mentioned earlier. And that's it. And I'll be happy to take questions.